0342. Welcome to the channel, everyone. I'm so glad you're here today. We've got a story for you that isn't loud. It isn't flashy. There's no car crash, no viral meme, no shouting match in front of a crowd. And honestly, that's exactly what makes it one of the most incredible stories I've ever come across. Before we dive in, do me a quick favor. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from, and it genuinely makes my day to read them. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's story is one you absolutely do not want to miss. Trust me on that one. Now today's story is about a young British royal guard who spotted something nobody else in that crowd noticed. Not the police, not the security cameras, not the hundreds of tourists standing right next to him, only him. And here's the part that will stick with you. He didn't say a word, not one. He couldn't. He held his post for the rest of his shift, completely still, completely silent, while a real threat walked freely just meters in front of him. What he did next, the moment his boots crossed back into the guard room, changed everything. This is the story of Lance Corporal Daniel Whitmore, the guard who spotted a real reconnaissance attempt and said nothing until relieved. The morning was the kind of gray that only London does properly. Low clouds sitting over the rooftops, the pavement still damp from rain that had fallen sometime before sunrise. A soft wind moved through the mall, lifting the corners of the Union Jacks lining the road. It was just past 9 in the morning, and the forecourt of Buckingham Palace was already filling with people. Tour groups from every corner of the world, school children in matching jackets, couples on honeymoon, phones lifted high, selfie sticks extended, the murmur of 100 different languages, all blending into one familiar London hum. Lance Corporal Daniel Whitmore stepped into position in front of the iron railings. 24 years old, Coldstream Guards, 4 years in. His red tunic was sharp, his bearskin sitting heavy on his head, his rifle resting against his shoulder exactly where it had been 1,000 times before. He took his stance, boots together, back straight, eyes fixed on a point in a little distance that was somewhere and nowhere at the same time. And then he did what every guard before him had done. He became still. For most people walking past, that stillness looked simple, just standing there, just holding a rifle, just wearing a funny hat as the tourists like to joke. But anyone who has ever worn that uniform knows the truth. Standing still for 2 hours is not standing still at all. It is constant work. The legs ache, the shoulders burn, the neck stiffens. The mind has nowhere to go and everywhere to be at once. You have to watch, you have to listen, you have to feel the air around you. You learn to read a crowd the same way a sailor reads the sea. Most people are waves, harmless, predictable, but every now and then something moves differently, and you feel it before you see it. Daniel had been on the palace rotation for 11 months. He knew the rhythm of the forecourt by heart. He knew which tour groups arrived at which times. He knew the regular street performers down by Green Park. He knew the cycle of the police patrols and the timing of the changing of the guard. He knew which spots tourists always crowded to and which spots they almost never did. And he knew, without needing to think about it, what a normal visitor looked like. A normal visitor took photos of him. They smiled, they pointed, they tried to make him laugh, and when he didn't, they shrugged and moved on. Sometimes they posed beside him. Sometimes they spoke to him, asked if he was real, asked if he was allowed to blink. The children were the best. They stared up with wide eyes, half believing he was a statue, half hoping he might wave. Daniel never reacted, but behind the stillness he saw all of them. The first hour of his shift passed without anything unusual. The crowd thickened, thickened again. A coach unloaded a group of Japanese tourists who were polite and quiet. A school party from somewhere in the north of England came past, the teacher counting heads with rising panic. An elderly American couple stood close to the railings for a long time, the wife explaining something to her husband, who kept asking her to speak up. And then just before 10:30, Daniel saw them. A man and a woman, mid-30s, both dressed sensibly for the weather. The man wore a dark green waterproof jacket, the kind you could buy at any outdoor shop on the high street, walking boots that were lightly worn, not new, not A small camera slung across his chest on a thin black strap. His face was unremarkable, pleasant, slightly tanned, hair short, neatly cut. The woman next to him had a soft canvas bag over her shoulder, a scarf knotted at her throat, and she carried a folded paper map, even though her phone was clearly visible in her other hand. They stopped at the railings, just like everyone else. "Look at him, Marcus," the woman said softly, just loud enough for Daniel to hear. Her accent was Canadian, pleasant, warm. "The hat is bigger than I thought it would be." The man, Marcus, laughed quietly. "It's the bearskin, Alina, it's traditional." Alina tilted her head. "Do you think he can hear us?" "Of course he can hear you," Marcus said. "He just can't react." They were doing exactly what every other couple at the railings did, saying exactly the kinds of things every other couple said. And yet, somewhere underneath Daniel's training, a thread tugged. Not loudly, not urgently, just a small, quiet tug. The kind you feel when something in a familiar room has been moved and you can't quite tell what. He didn't look at them directly. He didn't need to. His eyes were trained to gather without turning. And what he gathered in those first few seconds was this. The man, Marcus, was smiling at him, but his eyes were not on him. His eyes were moving past him, slowly, carefully, following the line of the railings, then the line of the gravel forecourt, then the line of the palace wall behind, then back along the rooftops, then down to the gate, then to the pavement, then to the curb. Tourists looked at the guard. This man was looking at everything except the guard. Daniel did not move. He did not blink any faster. He did not adjust his grip on the rifle, but inside the thread tightened. Alina lifted her phone. "Smile, darling," she said. Marcus posed beside her, his back to Daniel, and she took the photo. Then another, but Daniel noticed something. She wasn't framing Marcus. She was framing the space behind him. And when she lowered the phone, her thumb moved across the screen in a way that suggested she was checking the picture. But her eyes were on the corner of the building. A different kind of tug. "Let's walk along, see the other one," Marcus said, his voice cheerful. They moved along the railings slowly, the way tourists do when they want to take it all in. But Daniel noted the pace. It was too consistent. Tourists drift. They stop. They double back. They get distracted by a pigeon or a passing taxi. This pair moved like people counting their steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, pause, camera up, camera down. 1, 2, 3, 4, pause again. And then Daniel understood. They were measuring. He could not move. He could not turn his head. He could not call out. He could not even shift his weight. His post was his post. The rules had been beat into him on the parade ground until they were no longer rules but instincts. You do not break formation. You do not speak unless given a direct order. You do not leave your position. You hold, you watch, you remember. So that is what Daniel did. He held, he watched, and he began to remember. Marcus and Alina reached the corner of the forecourt and turned. They stopped near the second-sentry post, where another guard, a young soldier Daniel knew only as Whittaker, stood in identical stillness. Alina took a photo. Marcus took a photo. They lingered for exactly the same amount of time they had lingered in front of Daniel. Then they moved on. A tour group passed in front of Daniel, blocking his view for a moment. A child waved at him. A man in a Manchester United shirt asked his wife to take a picture of him standing next to the guard. Daniel did not flinch. When the group moved on, he found Marcus and Alina again. They had stopped near the center of the railings now, where the gravel forecourt was widest. Marcus crouched down, pretending to tie his bootlace, but Daniel saw what he was really doing. He was looking under the railings. At the angle, at the gap between the ground and the bottom bar, at the line of sight from a low position. Alina stood above him, smiling, occasionally lifting her phone, occasionally lowering it. She wasn't taking photos. She was watching the patrol path of the 2 Metropolitan Police officers who walked the perimeter every 20 minutes. Daniel had been counting their patrols since the start of his shift, out of habit, out of training. The officers had passed at 9:41 and again at 10:03. He didn't know it then, but Alina was counting them too. Marcus stood up. He stretched his back theatrically. He looked at his watch. Then he and Alina moved on again. And the morning, which had felt like every other morning, began to feel very different. Inside his stillness, Daniel ran through what he knew. Two people, mid-30s, Canadian accents, possibly genuine, possibly not. Sensible clothing, a camera that hadn't taken a single proper photograph of the palace, the guards, or anything a tourist would normally photograph. Movements that were too even, glances that were too systematic, behavior that, to 99 people out of 100, would have looked completely ordinary. But Daniel was the 100th. He had been trained for this, not specifically, not with these faces, but the principle had been drilled into every soldier on the palace rotation. Watch the watchers. Most people look at the guard, some people look at the palace. A very small number of people look at the security, and when you see one of those rare ones, you do not move, you do not react, you do not let them know you have seen them. You hold, you record, and you report only when you are off post. Marcus and Alina now drifted toward the central gate. They stood there arm in arm like any other couple. Alina lifted her phone. She took what looked like a selfie, but Daniel saw the angle. The phone was tilted upward. She was photographing the top of the gate, the cameras, the line of the wall, the position of the pillars. A small group of French schoolchildren ran past, laughing. A pigeon landed on the railing 2 meters from Daniel and stared at him with that flat, unimpressed look pigeons had. The wind picked up briefly, lifting the corner of someone's umbrella. Life on the forecourt carried on, ordinary and loud and busy. And nobody, not a single person in that entire crowd of hundreds, noticed what was happening. Nobody except Daniel. Marcus crossed in front of Daniel's post again, closer this time. He stopped. He raised his camera, and for the first time he actually took a picture of Daniel. He smiled as he did it, a polite tourist smile. The kind of smile you give the man behind the counter at a coffee shop when you don't know what to say. "Thank you, mate," Marcus said softly. Daniel did not move, did not blink, did not breathe any differently, but inside his heart was hammering against his ribs like a drum. Because in that single second when Marcus stood directly in front of him and smiled, Daniel saw it. The thing he had been waiting to see without knowing he was waiting for. The man's eyes flicked to Daniel's rifle, then to his belt, then to his radio, then to the small, almost invisible earpiece tucked beneath the strap of his bearskin, then back to Daniel's eyes. Checking, measuring, cataloging. Marcus stepped back, lowered the camera, and turned to Alina. "Got it," he said. It was the smallest thing, 2 words, said lightly, the way a husband might say it to a wife after taking the photograph she had been pestering him for. But Daniel heard it the way a soldier hears the click of a safety being released. He heard it the way a doctor hears a heartbeat skip. He heard it because he had been listening for it without knowing what it would sound like. The next 40 minutes were the longest of Daniel Whitmore's life. Marcus and Alina did not leave the forecourt. They moved in a slow, looping circuit, returning again and again to specific points. The corner where the railings turn, the patch of pavement just outside the central gate, the curb on the opposite side of the road. Each time they stopped, they spent exactly the right amount of time there to look like tourists, and not a second longer. Each time they moved, they walked at exactly the right pace to blend in, and not a step faster. At one point, Marcus dropped his small canvas bag. It was a casual movement, a clumsy fumble of the strap. The bag fell to the gravel with a soft thud. He bent down to pick it up, brushing it off, apologizing to no one in particular. And in those 4 seconds, Daniel saw both of their heads turn sharply, not at the bag, at him, and at Whittaker, the other guard. They were watching the reaction. They were testing it. Neither Daniel nor Whittaker moved. Marcus picked up the bag, smiled at Alina, walked on. But Daniel had seen the test for what it was. They wanted to know how the guards responded to a sudden, low-level disturbance. Now they knew. The guards did not respond. The guards held their post. The guards waited for someone else to react, and nobody else had. Daniel's mind was a recorder now. Faces, clothing, movements, times, the way Marcus held the camera, the way Alina's thumb worked her phone, the exact spot where the bag had fallen, the angle at which Marcus had crouched, the number of times they had circled back to the corner of the railings, the color of Alina's scarf, the faint mark of a watch-tan line on Marcus's wrist, the watch itself absent, the way they spoke to each other, the words too clean, the laughter too timed. He could not write it down. He could not say it aloud. He could only hold it inside himself, the way a man holds his breath underwater, counting silently, trusting that the surface will come. The minutes dragged. A child started crying somewhere near the gate. A street sweeper moved past with his cart, the wheels squeaking. A cloud broke and a thin column of sunlight fell across the forecourt for a few seconds before the gray closed again. An old man in a flat cap walked up to the railing, stood beside Daniel for a long moment, then said quietly, "Don't suppose you fancy a cup of tea, son?" He smiled at his own joke and shuffled away. Daniel did not move, did not blink, did not feel the old man at all, really, because every part of him was somewhere else, tracking two figures who were now standing near the curb on the far side of the road. Marcus checked his watch, the one he wasn't wearing. He caught himself, lowered his hand, and instead pulled his phone from his pocket, glanced at it, nodded once to Alina. They began to walk. Not away, not yet. They walked along the railings one final time, past Whitaker's post, past the central gate, and then directly past Daniel's. As they passed, Marcus turned his head slightly. He looked Daniel in the eye, and he smiled. A small, private smile. The smile of a man who believed he had just done something perfectly. The smile of a man who believed he had won. Daniel did not return the smile. Daniel did not exist as far as the smile was concerned. He was a piece of the building, a part of the railings, a red and black ornament that breathed only because biology demanded it. But behind his eyes, Lance Corporal Daniel Whitmore was burning every single detail of Marcus's face into his memory, like a brand into leather. They walked away, across the road, past the Victoria Memorial, up the mall, two ordinary tourists strolling at a leisurely pace, hand in hand, blending back into the great mass of London the way a single drop blends back into the sea. Daniel held his post. There were 90 minutes left on his shift. 90 minutes, 5,400 seconds. He knew because he counted them, not deliberately. The counting just started the way it sometimes does when a man has nothing else to anchor him. The wind picked up again. A bus rumbled past on the road behind the crowd. A toddler escaped from her mother's grip and ran toward the railing, slapping them with both hands, laughing. Daniel did not move. The mother apologized, scooped her up, retreated. Daniel did not move. A photographer with a long lens set up across the road, framing the palace. Daniel watched him for the entire 10 minutes he was there, cataloging him too, just in case. The man was a tourist. Daniel knew it within 20 seconds, but he watched anyway because that was the discipline. You do not stop watching just because the thing you are watching looks innocent. Innocence is what threats wear. A coachload of Italian schoolchildren arrived. Then a group of older American visitors with a guide who spoke loudly about the history of the changing of the guard. A young couple kissed in front of the gate and asked a stranger to photograph them. The stranger took 3 pictures, gave a thumbs up, and walked off. Daniel watched it all. He watched the way a lighthouse watches the sea, patient, unmoving, always. His legs ached. His shoulders had passed beyond burning into something cold and numb. His mouth was dry. The strap of his bearskin pressed against his throat in a way that, on a normal day, he would have ignored, but today felt like a hand. He ignored it anyway. He breathed through his nose, slowly, quietly, the way they taught you, the way your body learned to do without you telling it. And he ran through the report in his head, again, then again, then again, refining it, polishing it, stripping out any word that was not necessary. A soldier's report, clean, precise, useless if it was wrong, lethal if it was right. At 12:02, Daniel heard boots on gravel behind him. The familiar rhythm, the unhurried tread of a man who knew exactly where he was going. Lance Corporal James Ashford, his relief. The handover was a small ritual performed 1,000 times before, performed exactly the same way it had always been performed. James took his position beside Daniel. They exchanged the briefest of glances, the kind only soldiers know how to give. James gave the smallest nod. Daniel returned it. James stepped forward. Daniel stepped back. James assumed the stance. Daniel turned. And the moment Daniel's boots crossed the threshold of the guardroom, he was a different man. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't allow a single flicker of urgency to show on his face until the heavy door had closed behind him. Then he removed his bearskin, set it carefully on the rack, and walked straight to the duty NCO's desk. Sergeant Major Robert Caldwell looked up. 26 years in the Coldstreams, a face like a closed door. He had seen every kind of soldier walk through that guard room, and he could read each of them in a single glance. He looked at Daniel, and he set down his pen. "Whitmore," he said. "Sir," Daniel said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. "Report." Daniel reported, cleanly, precisely, without dramatics. 2 persons of interest, male and female, mid-30s, Canadian accents possibly covered, approximate height and build, clothing in detail, the man's camera, the woman's bag and scarf, the pattern of their movement, the measurement, the timing, the test with the bag, the photographs of cameras, gates, walls, rooftops, the smile, the 2 words, the direction of departure, the time of departure to the minute. Sergeant Major Caldwell did not interrupt, did not write anything down, did not need to. His face did not change. But by the time Daniel finished, Caldwell was already reaching for the phone on his desk. "Stay here," he said. He spoke into the phone for less than 30 seconds, a few crisp sentences, a code word Daniel did not recognize, a name, a location, a time. He set the phone down. He stood up. And then, for the first time since Daniel had stepped into the room, Sergeant Major Robert Caldwell looked at him directly. "Good lad," he said quietly. That was all, 2 words, and Daniel felt them land somewhere deep inside his chest, in a place that had been holding its breath since Marcus and Alina had first stopped at the railings. What happened in the next 40 minutes happened in places Daniel never saw. So 14 royalty protection officers moved. Counterterrorism units moved. Metropolitan police units moved. The mall was quietly watched. The tube stations around Buckingham Palace were quietly watched. Hotel registers were quietly checked. A name appeared, then another name, then a third that had been on a watch list for nearly a year. The pieces, which had looked like nothing in isolation, began to fit together in a room far above Daniel's pay grade. At 1:14 that afternoon, a man and a woman matching the description Daniel had given were intercepted as they boarded a Eurostar service at St. Pancras International. They did not run. They did not protest. The man, calm and polite to the end, said only one thing in an accent that was no longer Canadian. "You found us very quickly." It would later emerge that the small canvas bag Alina had been carrying contained 2 encrypted memory cards, a notebook of timings written in shorthand, and a folded paper map with marks that no tourist would ever make. The camera, around Marcus's neck, had a modified lens designed for one purpose only, and that purpose had nothing to do with holiday photographs. The pair were part of a larger network. 6 other arrests followed in the week that came after. None of it ever made the front pages. None of it was ever spoken about publicly. None of it ever will be in detail. And Daniel Whitmore went back on rotation 3 days later, as if nothing had happened. He did not receive a medal. He did not receive a commendation that anyone outside a very small office would ever know about. There was no parade. There was no interview. There was no viral video. The tourists who passed his post the following week looked at him exactly the same way the tourists had always looked at him. A man in a red tunic and a tall hat, a statue, a photograph, a joke about whether he was allowed to blink. Sergeant Major Caldwell, the next time he saw Daniel, gave him the smallest of nods across the parade ground. Daniel returned it. Nothing more was said. Nothing more needed to be said. Years later, when Daniel was older and his service was behind him, when the bearskin was packed away in a box at the top of a wardrobe, he would sometimes be asked at dinner parties what the strangest thing was that ever happened to him on duty at the palace. And he would smile politely and he would say, "Oh, you know, mostly tourists, mostly nothing." And the conversation would move on, and he would take a sip of his drink, and only he would know. Because that is what discipline really is. Not the standing still, not the silence, not the uniform. Discipline is the willingness to do the hardest thing in the world, which is to see something, and to do nothing about it in the exact moment when every nerve in your body is screaming at you to act. Discipline is trusting the system, trusting your training, trusting that the man in the guardroom will pick up the phone, and that the people on the other end of the phone will do what they need to do, and that the threat will be stopped not by the loudest man in the room, but by the quietest. Discipline is knowing that your part of the job is small, and doing it perfectly anyway, because small parts done perfectly are what keep entire cities safe. Lance Corporal Daniel Whitmore stood at his post that gray October morning for 120 minutes. He saw what nobody else saw. He said what nobody else needed him to say, when he was finally allowed to say it. And because of him, a real threat that had walked, smiling, through one of the most photographed places in the world, walked into a quiet room at St. Pancras instead of onto a train. And not one of the tourists who took his picture that morning will ever know. I genuinely don't know what to say about this one. There's something about it that just sits with you, isn't there? No shouting, no drama, no crowd cheering. Just a young man in a red tunic doing his job perfectly in the only way it could have been done. And the result of that quiet, invisible discipline was that real people, real lives were kept safe. People who will never know his name. People who walked past him that morning, took a photograph and walked on. I want to hear from you, honestly. Do you think you could have done it? Could you have stood there completely still, completely silent for 90 more minutes while a real threat moved freely just a few meters away from you? Or would you have broken? Would you have moved? Would you have said something to the wrong person at the wrong time and given it all away? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I genuinely love hearing what you all think. And listen, if this story moved you even a little bit, please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Turn on your notifications too, because tomorrow's story is something completely different, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. There are more incredible, jaw-dropping stories coming your way every single day, and I want you to be part of them. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember, sometimes the loudest heroes in the world are the ones who never make a sound.